Sorry, waiting for technology to do its thing. Oh, there we go. Can you hear me? Oh, for goodness sake. Okay. There we go. All right. Hi, my name is Mina, like you said, and I'm going to talk to you today about styling Hillary. This talk could also be called Trying and Failing to Save the Republic with CSS. Or it could also be called The Longest 18 Months of My Life, Oh My God. So caution real quick, this talk may contain politics, although being an American in Canada, I'm not sure how much you care about my politics, so you can take that with a grain of salt. You can reach me at my website, mina.codes, or at Twitter at Mina Markham. As you said, I currently work at Slack, but what I'm going to talk to you today is about the 2 years-ish I spent working for Hillary for America, which was Secretary Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. I'm going to make a couple of assumptions during this talk. One, that you have heard of Hillary Clinton, and two, that you've read the blog post I wrote about Pantsuit, which goes over certain things in detail that I won't be talking about today, just to kind of save some time. But basically, if you've ever worked on any kind of like campaign, presidential or whatever, it's kind of like a 18 or insert number amount of months nationally televised hackathon. Like you are constantly going, and every move you make is watched by the entire country and in some cases the world. While I was there, I worked on a lot of things. Being one of the first engineers on staff and actually the first one that was hired, I spent a lot of time wearing various hats. Some things I did was I broke the homepage during one of her biggest speeches. That was a great moment for me. I built a design system that powered a lot of our entities on HillaryClinton.com, which is mainly what I'll be talking to you about today. I also led accessibility efforts for compliance to make sure our sites were completely accessible. I helped build the CMS for the new site. And more importantly, I had the time of my life. Now, what I'm going to focus on is just the design system, implementing a redesign, and I'll hopefully show you why I had the time of my life. So you're probably wondering, how in the world do you get a job like this? How do you get a job working on a presidential campaign for what you hope is the first female president? Well, the whole thing started, funnily enough, with an email. Yeah, I know a lot of people have email jokes. I've heard them all. Please don't tell me any. I'm kind of over it. But it did start with an email that was the vaguest of vague emails. It said something along the lines of, please come work for this social good cause, which I did what any normal person would do in that situation. Is I ignored the email for about a week. And when I got back to her and she actually told me what it was, after about a month of interviewing with several different people, I was able to get the offer letter and start working about a month into her campaign. Now, when I started, the tech team was very small. I was the fourth engineer in the office, not counting our CTO and a couple of other back-end engineers. So this was the very first picture of the tech team as it was. And on election day, it stood around this size, about 80 people, including engineers, product managers, and designers. So the story of Pantsuit started with Kyle Rush, the deputy CTO, telling me that we need a bootstrap. And what he meant by that was we needed some kind of pattern library or CSS framework to help us build the various microsites and apps that we need very quickly, efficiently, and consistently. Okay, so pattern library, I thought you said this was about design systems. Well, it is. It's about design systems, pattern libraries, and style guides. All of these things basically mean that naming things is hard. So I'm going to go over a few terms that I'll be referring to during the talk so you kind of have a better idea of what I mean by things. So first off, a pattern library is a library of UI patterns. It's kind of it's usually like a UI kit or things that a designer might use to build an interface. Whereas a framework, a CSS or front-end framework, is the front-end code that it encompasses, translates all of those patterns inside the UI kit or the pattern library. A style guide would be the documentation for the CSS framework for the engineering or the developers to use. And a design system is all of the above and then a lot more. One of my favorite diagrams shows this pretty well, where a design system kind of can encompass several different things that have to do with any kind of visual or code that encompasses the front end of a site. Pantsuit design system encompasses these things: the style guide, the UI kit, it had a visual design language, there were dev and coding standards, and there was a UI presentation layer in the documentation. Okay, so he said that we need to have a bootstrap, but it also needs to have kind of a good name. And you're probably thinking, okay, well, Pantsuit, why would you name something Pantsuit? Well, if you've ever, like I said, ever heard of or seen Hillary Clinton, the name in retrospect makes a lot of sense. Well, I was thoroughly unconvinced of this name when I thought of it. I was like, I can't possibly call it that, right? Like, am I leaning into it too much? No, that's a good idea. No, I really, really probably shouldn't do this. In the end, obviously, when I told people this is what I had in mind, they were like, oh yeah, definitely, that's the best thing, that's the best name I've ever heard. But yeah, I was not at all convinced when it first happened. Okay, so why do we need this in the first place? Why did Kyle tell me that? Why would, given the very short amount of time we had to accomplish something and the limited resources we have, why would we devote time to building a design system? After all, we're just building one site. We're just building HillaryClinton.com. Well, HillaryClinton.com actually encompasses several dozens of different code bases, hundreds of microsites. It was a very large and prolific piece of engineering. Excuse me. So the homepage of HillaryClinton.com lived in what we called Secretary of State list, or it was the CMS and storytelling part of the site. That was the team that I was on, the CMS and storytelling team, which focused on anything that was purely content-driven. So that was the homepage, that was her policy pages, bio pages, the blog, and any kind of state-driven pages. So anything that would need rapid iteration or rapid content on it, that was a team that handled. Our team handled that, and that was one separate code base. /donate was a different code base that was strictly for fundraising and collection of people's information in order to solicit more donations. So that was another team, another code base, completely separate entity. Same with our call tool, which was ran by the voter team. It was, again, another code base, another workflow, completely different, separate project. Our engagement team did things like Literally Trump, which was a real-time fact checker where you could type in something like the word women, and you can see actual quotes and sources for what our opponent said about any particular topic. And something like The Briefing, which was content management driven, but had a completely different UI, completely different theme style on top of it. I say all this to say that we had multiple code bases that needed to share a one UI like underneath it all. Pantsuit had several different stakeholders, some being the content or storytelling team, which was a team I was embedded on. There was also the fundraising team, organizing team, which worked internally with our organizers, the voter team, which worked on projects at the American public scene, the engagement team, which did fun things of Literally Trump, but also internal teams like the data infrastructure team or the analytics department who would do internal dashboards to help them make sense of all the data we were collecting. The partners I was using to help me build Pantsuit would be our design team, which was our visual designers and our product designers. And in the end, I was supported by both our front-end ops, who handled all of the build systems and compiling and making the NPM modules, and our DevOps team, which handled the deployment of the assets and getting things up on the CDN. But the Pantsuit team itself was just me. And I wasn't actually even dedicated to the project full-time myself. So being one person having to serve dozens of engineers and apps, I had to make some very quick decisions, and I will tell you like the reason behind a lot of these decisions now. One of the main mitigating factors behind some decisions that I made was time and speed. When you have only a handful of weeks to ship any given project, you quickly realize that getting something done is better than getting it perfect. And that's because our campaign was driven by external sources. Our deadlines were driven by external events. We had to meet deadlines for things like debates and for things like for conventions and caucuses and elections, things that had very immutable dates that if we didn't make, the product might as well not exist. So we learned very quickly to just ship on time no matter what. That was always the objective. Pantsuit 1.0 was created in about 6 weeks, which doesn't seem like a lot of time, but in campaign world, like that felt like an eternity. But that was 6 weeks for me to establish and write up new coding standards for our front end, create the CSS architecture, actually build the component library, implement prototypes, and create the documentation. That all took place in the span of about 6 weeks, and I felt bad taking as much time as I did to do it. So when you're working at a pace like that, you kind of learn that technical debt becomes your friend. Like I said, you make decisions and you make concessions that you wouldn't necessarily make if you had more time to develop the project and more time to like maintain and go back and correct things. So yeah, truth is, I ended up doing things that didn't make me feel like all that great at the time, knowing that maybe I would get back to it eventually. But and the code base was kind of littered with things like this, which I did make a point to go back and refactor as much as I could. But like I said, sometimes you would have to go ahead and just make concessions, because as the time would progress, the need for maintainability of our code decreased, whereas the need for stability increased dramatically. We didn't want anything to go wrong the last few weeks, on the site at least. So we were very careful to just make sure that we didn't have any kind of regressions or anything like that. So we would do hacky things like that occasionally just to make sure, like, you know, to be safe, let's just go ahead and get it done and not break anything. So the moral of that story for in this particular environment is that if you don't have any technical debt, then you probably aren't moving fast enough. Our leaders encouraged us to incur technical debt because, like I said, getting things done was paramount. Getting things out the door was our most important objective. Like, so the conclusion being, like, I kind of learned to just let things go after a while. I let go of the need to control the code base, let go of the need to control how people were using my product because, again, the end goal was much more important than making sure that everyone was following the rules that I set out. Okay, so the meat of this, how did I make this thing? The first thing I did when I was asked to create the first version of Pantsuit, which there's two different versions to match both versions of our site. The first version of Pantsuit was a code rewrite. I was charged with completely redoing all of our CSS code base, but not visually changing anything. And the reason for that is we were going to start doing A/B testing and things on the interface, and we wanted to start from a clean code base, but we didn't want to introduce any new variables like changing any of the UI up front. So I was told to match everything you see, but rewrite it all. So the first thing I did was I took an audit of what the current site was like. This kind of gave me a good place to start where I can start feeling where the wins were, where the opportunities for big refactoring that where they were in the code base. So I did the audit of the CSS, but I also did an inventory of the visual interface. I took screenshots of every page I could find, and I started categorizing everything I saw. So I categorized things in like all the different forms of navigation that existed, all the different button styles that existed, all of the different heading or typography styles that existed. And I presented these findings, both of the CSS audits and of the UI audits, to both the director of design and the director of front end, who were already on board with the fact that we needed this project. So that was helpful for me, that I didn't have to actively sell them on this idea. But if I did, using those kind of presentation would be how I would have approached doing so. But what I used that meeting as a chance to say, okay, here's the lay of the land. This is what the problem is. Here's how I plan to approach it, and this is about how much time I think it will take. And having that information in front of them, I was given like full speed ahead to go and kind of do what I needed to do. When time came around for the second version of Pantsuit, which was in conjunction with the redesign of the website, I wasn't burdened with having to try to recreate an existing UI and not being able to have any sort of say in it. I was working in conjunction with the lead designer of the site, and he and I would work together to create the interface for both the website and then extract the components from Pantsuit as that occurred. So the way I approached starting that project was a little bit different. I took the designs, the mock-ups that he gave me, I printed them out, and I started cutting up the interface. And I categorized them in a much similarly to the UI inventory I did before, but this was much more tangible and physical. And I did that because it helped both the designers and the product managers sort of have a much more like tangible idea. Okay, here's the patterns that I'm seeing. And it was very easy to start identifying like one-off outliers and say maybe we can make this more consistent. And it was the way that the actual system of the components started to form. So the process I went through when building both the second version of Pantsuit and building the redesign of HillaryClinton.com at the same time was kind of a cycle of definition, implementation, testing, and iterating. Now, it wasn't always this clean. It didn't always work in quite that order. Sometimes I did things kind of backwards or forwards, but that's about the four different steps that I took to do something like this. The first step, of course, was defining what the components are. And like I said, I would take an interface that I would see, a page that I would see, and I would start to try to look for repeating patterns in that page. So for this page, you can see I saw that that image and that text block lockup was repeating in both the smaller blog slider that we have, but also that secondary blog spot we had there that actually repeated on several different pages as well, like the policy pages and blog pages. So I quickly identified that's clearly a pattern that needs to be defined and extracted. Also, there was the button styles, which the top button is a normal like button link, but the buttons inside of that chip-in CTA, those were actually like physical. Those were actually like button styles as opposed to like a link button because they weren't linking anywhere. They were more of a functional button. So I would establish first the UI patterns, but then I would start thinking about the functionality of it so that I could separate what was the function of the donate button in the header, which needed to be obviously a link to a different page, and the actual donate buttons in that smaller CTA section, which needed to have an action on them with the donation, with the actually donating money at the time. And it was there that I learned that I probably needed to separate the semantic headings from the class names, and this is where I established it was time to do a class-based system. Whereas, so that way people can get the styles they needed without forcing them to pick whatever HTML markup that I wanted them to use. It was also good for accessibility, which I talk about in the article, so I won't get too deep into, but basically using a class-based system allowed me to abstract out all of these styles and allow people to choose the markup that was best for like the semantic purpose of it. And eventually those sessions of extracting out all of the UIs, the UI components, went back into the UI kit that our lead designer was creating, and he would create a sketch file for the other designers to use that mimicked the components that he and I had decided needed to exist. So the designers would get something like this, and I would have worked on translating this into code. Which next thing I do is how would I implement this? Well, the best way I can think to do it was to do it live. I worked very closely with Victor, who was our designer of the site. We would have these sessions called pixel engineering. Now, we called them pixel engineering because, truth be told, they were pixel pushing sessions, but I have a visceral reaction to the term pixel pushing, so they named it pixel engineering really to appease my ego. But we would have sessions where he and I would sit down, and I would show him where I was in the process of translating the mock-ups to a full-on page. And then we would sort of try to identify where the problem areas might lie. Excuse me. Basically, we were dog fooding. I was consuming my own product. I imported the Pantsuit library separately into sorry, I love this gift. I imported the Pantsuit library into the redesigned site, and then I would use it to create the pages for the site. And as I was creating the pages, I would go back, make tweaks in the browser in order to like in order to recreate the vision that Victor had. And once he and I decided that the tweaks I made in the browser were good, I would then save them back to the Pantsuit library, commit them, and push them. So there was kind of this constant like back and forth between the framework, the product, and the UI kit. And the changes could occur in any particular moment, like maybe as he was designing, he decided that the color scheme was off, and so he would make a change in the UI kit, which I would then translate back into the product to make sure that it looked good in context. And if it did, I would translate that back to the UI, the Pantsuit library, to make and see that it looked good out of context. So it was a back and forth of seeing things in isolation in Pantsuit by itself, and then seeing things as they lived and breathed in the product, and making sure that they looked and acted appropriately in both of those environments, both in context and out of context. So when we were doing these pixel engineering sessions, basically I would have HillaryClinton.com up on my computer quite a bit, but it didn't actually look like this on my computer. Since I had to stare at it all day, every day for like months, I decided to make it a little bit more fun, and so when you saw it on my computer, it actually looked like that. Because you know, I wanted to stare at something fun for hours on end, so I put Beyonce all over the place, and it was great. So the last part of this cycle is the testing and iteration cycle. And when I said I put the components in isolation, there was this page in the documentation that I called the closet or kitchen sink, if you want to use that term, that basically listed out every component that I had created. So you can see it in isolation from the rest of a page, the rest of a mock-up, and you can see how it operates on its own. So from there, and this was all live code, so you can hover over buttons, you can focus on them, you can kind of see the various states that things were created in on one, like in out of context. But as I was building the redesigned site, you could see them in context, including what I did for accessibility compliance. As I was building the site, I would also repeatedly test for accessibility to make sure that we were meeting the standards and that people with various types of disabilities were able to access what they needed. This testing process is actually how I discovered that we had no focus states on the site. We had hover states, but we didn't account for what happens when people tap through the site. And so going back, when I discovered that, I went back to our designer, Victor, and told him that we didn't have any hover states. And he and I decided what that design should look like, and we implemented a more accessible experience based on me doing some user testing and some testing in the browser myself. As you can see, the hover states, the focus states are, they were a little light for my liking. They were that light dotted border you saw on some of the links. That actually was a lot darker and more prominent the first time I implemented it. It was this really dark blue outline, like 3, 4, or 5 point lines. And I did this without talking to our chief product officer. I was given the go-ahead to make things accessible, so I kind of took it upon myself to do that. But when she saw the design that I chose, she was not pleased with this huge blue outline on everything on the site. And so she kind of let it go for a while. She was like, okay, if this is what we need to be accessible, then I'll eat it and we can just deal with it. But I could tell more and more, like, she just did not approve of it. And so we compromised with keeping the outline but making it a lot lighter, which had its pros and cons. Like, it was there, which was good, but for people with low vision, it wasn't necessarily the best choice. But that was one of the compromises that I made during that testing and iteration process. Okay, so you're probably thinking, well, how did you do this whole thing by yourself? It seems like a lot of things for one person to accomplish. Well, I did it by myself, one with the trust and support of my superiors, which was really great to have. They were all bought in, and they just trusted me to make my best judgments and kind of let me run, which was really great. But it also meant that I didn't have a lot of opportunity to bounce my ideas off of people and to learn from people. So I sought out collaboration as much as possible, both with those pixel engineering sessions that I had with Victor, but also with something that we ended up dubbing the Pantsuit Council. The Pantsuit Council was like a weekly-ish check-in of the major stakeholders for the system. It was myself and Victor, our main designer, but also it was the technical leads for some of the other projects, like for some of the other Agile teams, the donations team, the fundraising team and also their designers, and we all would meet to see whether or not the system was meeting their needs, and they would tell me the kind of things that they're working on, and we would decide if anything they've been doing should be added to the system itself, if it could benefit other teams. Now, we didn't have a design system for Pantsuit team per se. Like I said, it was just me. But if we did, the team would have looked something like that. It would have been me as the lead person on it, and it would have included people from all the major stakeholders who could represent their needs and their wants to the larger group, and we can all decide together what the system should be, what should be included, what should be left out and left to be implemented on a product level. And also with the support, like I said, of the front end and the ops. So I think the ideal design systems team would probably look something like that. It would be one cohesive team that was embedded on other teams to represent like both the needs of the system back to the major stakeholders and then represent the stakeholders' needs back to the larger system team. Other thing I did to mitigate the fact that I was just one person was I documented everything I could think of. I documented my thought process. I documented how to use the system because I didn't want to be the bottleneck. As I said before, we were doing lots of fast iteration, lots of fast work, and I didn't want to be the person that held up any individual team. So I made a decision to document as much as I could think of. Pantsuit was the documentation was created using KSS Node and Assemble to generate the pages, and we posted them up on an S3 server. I won't go a lot into the actual like how to use KSS Node because that's easily searchable, but KSS Node allowed me to do something like this. I documented both how to consume Pantsuit, which I'll get into later, like the various ways people consume Pantsuit, but also the grid system and how to use the different versions of the grid system, how to use and what the different types of components were. I also documented the SAS logic that was behind all of these things. So if someone saw if I didn't create a component or something that they needed, they could look in the SAS logic and see, okay, well, how is she making this other thing? Maybe I can use that to create what I need. So I documented all the SAS code that was underlying the system as well. And for the designers, I documented all the color schemes and the design language of it. And I included templates for basic layouts that I was noticing people were implementing over and over again. I created some basic scaffolds and put them up so people can have a very quick way to start off a new project. And I learned from all our developers that the documentation really helped them not only to understand how to use the system, but also gave them ideas for new projects. When they were deciding like other things they wanted to do, sometimes looking at Pantsuit helped them decide what the layout should be of those particular projects, which was a use case that I didn't actually think of. So that was really cool to hear, is that it wasn't just a source of like instruction, it was also a source of inspiration. And the last thing I did to mitigate the fact that I was one person trying to help a lot of people is I automated as much as possible. Now, it's kind of ironic now that I work at Slack because I use Slack to a very high degree when I was trying to communicate with people what Pantsuit was and how to use it. The main thing I did was I created a Slack bot or a Slack integration to let people know when there were new versions of Pantsuit. I did this by creating like I said, a webhook that I used in the post-publish file of our package that says to post this message to the Slack room whenever a new version was published. And it would tell them, first of all, what version number it was. It would link them to the release notes of that version and link them back to the documentation so they could see both what has changed and they can see like the new updated examples of what has changed. So that looked a little bit like this. Pantsuit was a centralized repo that I versioned with Simber to let people know like whether it was a minor update or a major update. And then whenever I would push to the GitHub repo, that would push the documentation up to the CDN. When I did npm publish, that would publish the module to our npm server, but also that npm publish is what triggered the Slack bot to tell them that there is a new version for them to use. This is also the different ways people could consume Pantsuit. There was a CDN that was hosted on S3, which was triggered when I did a publish. It would publish all of the files up to the S3 server, and it also published a compiled CSS up on S3. And that compiled CSS file was the way that our internal teams, like our backend teams or our analytics teams, used to consume Pantsuit. And they used those because they didn't have a front-end build process like everyone else, and they weren't comfortable with like the Gulp process or the Webpack process we had. So I had just a compiled CSS version for them to use to make it easier for them to get started that way. There was also the NPM module that people would use, include as a dependency in their package.json. That was actually the most common way people consume Pantsuit. And then there was the way that I intended people to use Pantsuit, which was to download it manually and take only the parts of it they needed and leave the rest. And that was only used by our donations team. Now, the reason that I decided that people should do it that way is because it made for a smaller code base and a smaller file. You didn't have to take the whole of the library. Very few people needed everything that was encompassed in the library. But for convenience purposes, a lot of people ended up using the NPM module way. And basically, it said that our SRE said it was a good way for us to keep things updated very consistently and cache files and keep everything very instantaneously updated and very easily updated. Now, the outcome of this was, as you heard in the intro, a lot of people started paying attention to what Pantsuit was when I published a Medium post. It was really cool to see like a lot of people talking about this thing that I built, and I just didn't expect that would become a thing. But what really mattered to me was how our engineers felt about it. And I got great positive feedback from all of them saying that it was probably one of the best tools at their disposal, which made me feel like I had actually done my job very well. My job was to make their lives easier, and the fact that I was able to do so made me feel like, okay, I've accomplished what I came here to do. But lastly, it is really good to hear the candidate, the person you're making these things for, say that she enjoys your work. And so when I got the Slack message from an advisor to Hillary Clinton saying how much she loved the site, well, you know, I did a little happy dance, I got all in my feels, and it was great. Okay, I want to use the last bit of my time to talk about something that a lot of people probably have not heard of, at least in relation to me. Like I said, when you work for one of the most famous women in the world, people tend to pay attention to you, and it's not always a good thing. I got a lot of, for lack of a better term, shit from the general public for working for her. And I don't know if it was like a Clinton staffer thing or a woman thing or a black thing or some combination thereof, but I pushed a lot of people's buttons for God knows what reason. And I tried to just kind of take it in stride and not deal too much with it and not let it bother me too much, but it gets really hard to do that when you see people talking specifically about you and talking about ways they can hack you because they think that for some reason you designing her CSS library is a good way to bring down the site. So maybe if we bring down her, we can bring down the site. I didn't say they were smart people, but that's what happened. They also tended to think things like, because I was a woman, maybe I didn't actually write certain bits of code, which is ironic because the example that they chose to use was exactly the thing that I wrote. So I felt like this a lot of the time, just whatever. Moral of that is, Reddit is a wasteland. Amen. I mean, it's not just Reddit, though, because I did something funny after the campaign was over. Is I made a joke about updating my LinkedIn saying that I helped fight the rise of fascism in the U.S. And I intended it as a joke, and I didn't think much of it, but then I started getting responses from people who just wanted to make sure that I knew what they thought of me. And it's just like, really? What? So yeah, Twitter is also a wasteland. And sometimes, I guess people like to talk to me about things. I was interviewed by Cosmo with a bunch of my other coworkers about what our lives are like now. It was a fun piece saying, here's what some of the Hillary Clinton campaign staff are doing. Nothing controversial about it. And yet still, somebody feels the need to tell us that we probably should just not exist anymore. So just like, really? So yeah, Facebook is also a wasteland. But really, just in general, like, the internet is a wasteland. And for the record, like, the outside world tended to make us feel like crap a lot, but working for Hillary Clinton was probably the most life-altering, greatest privilege of my life, and I don't regret a moment of it. So when I start getting things like this from people saying that, you know, we're a bunch of novices, I try to do what Michelle Obama says is, you know, when they go low, we go high, but, you know, occasionally I just can't help myself. Because, you know, yeah. Okay, I'm running out of time, so real quick I want to touch on one aspect of this that did not occur to me, which was fake news. People tended to get a lot of things wrong about when they were writing about us. Like, for example, I saw this article that suggested that we used Greenhouse as a CMS, which, like, no? How would you even do that? But sometimes it was more insidious. There was this campaign to tell people that they could vote via text. They were emulating these real ads that we put on Facebook and Twitter, telling people to text us to get information about certain events. Well, they took it to text to vote for Hillary, which is not a thing you can do. You cannot text via vote, or you cannot vote via text. So it was this weird sort of misinformation campaign that happened, which leads me to my last point about Pantsuit, which is the open source part of it. For various reasons, particularly the last one I mentioned, I was not able to open source Pantsuit because there was, like I said, a campaign of people who wanted to use our brand against us. I was alerted to people trying to download our font to use for those fake ads. And so I can only imagine if I put the entire library out there, what kind of damage would have been done with that. I mean, even still, they managed to put up a fake site that looked very similar to the real thing, telling people to vote for Hillary online. So, was it worth it? I get that question a lot. And working on campaigns was a really grueling experience. It takes a lot out of you. Sometimes you lose touch with your friends and family, and you don't really know, you kind of go into a tunnel vision thing. But in the 18 months that I spent there, I will remember a lot of things from it. I'll remember eating a heck of a lot of Oreos. I'll remember Winnie the dog, who was like our unofficial mascot and therapy dog. I remember a lot of booze. I remember having a lot of late night fun and going to bars with people. I remember meeting former presidents. I remember seeing the URL of a site that I built on the side of a plane. I remember probably the coolest thing I will ever do is demoing HillaryClinton.com to Hillary Clinton herself. But even after it was over, the next day, leaving the office after the election, I remember walking out of the building and seeing kids on the sidewalk drawing in chalk thank you messages and support messages to both Hillary and the staff members. I remember the people of New York erecting this makeshift subway monument out of Post-its with words of congratulations and protest and resistance. And I remember the last time I saw Hillary Clinton, which was 3 days after what had to have been the worst day of her life, telling me not to give up, telling me she was proud of me and thanking me for helping her. So I remember a lot of things. I remember joy and friendship and support and feeling better than I have felt in a long time. So when people ask me, was it worth it? And when people ask me where I was when this whole thing went down, I can say I was there. Because, literally, I was right there. So was the whole thing worth it? Hell yes. Thank you very much.